Welcome to episode 4 of the CXO Scene podcast. I'm John Lynn, the founder of healthcarescene.com, a network of leading healthcare IT resources, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, David Chou. Welcome, David.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for joining in today on this podcast, or actually live, but somehow I'm having technical trouble, so it'll be a podcast for me only.
That's all right. Your picture's nice. So I think, at the end of the day, people are watching this for what we say, not how we look. At least that's, I think, most people's intention. So it's great. David Chou is the Vice President and Chief Information and Digital Officer at Children's Mercy, Kansas City. You can find him at dchow1107. So it's great having you. You ready for an exciting 4th episode?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, we have 3 topics today. If you're watching live, you can see them in the chat window. Feel free to chime in as well in the chat window. If you have questions, comments, if possible, we'll try to incorporate them. Sometimes we get chatting and miss it. But the first topic is around Megamergers. And we really, if you look at the show notes, you'll see a link to a announcement that UNC Healthcare and Carolinas Healthcare were announced a merger of sorts. It sounds like they're creating a new entity that will own both organizations. So I guess that's technically a merger between these 2 massive health systems. So do you want to kick off some thoughts? Is this a good thing for them? Is it good for patients? What do you say, David Chou?
Well, this is actually the trend, right? You think about where hospitals and health systems are moving towards. The future of healthcare is really the number of beds are going to decrease. So it will decrease because of affiliations or deals like this. And you see a lot of this happening as we speak, whether you want to call it either mergers or even affiliations, because as the reimbursement model changes, everyone's moving towards value-based care, big IT or healthcare buzzword. But it is really changing. And in order to really stay relevant from a healthcare operation and financial standpoint, you got to have size. And the only way to get size and patients live is to have these mega mergers or affiliations. So that's one of the primary reasons why you're seeing these types of deals. And what's unique about it is you're starting to see academic medical centers like a university medical systems with a nonprofit affiliating. And what potentially is happening is you're going to see some of the higher acuity specialty surgical procedures being done at whether it's the university setting or at the nonprofit setting. But there's going to be carve-outs to where not everyone's going to perform the same type of quality and the same type of specialty. There's going to be carve-outs to where the specialties are going to be done at these academic medical centers, and then some of the other ones are going to be more of the lower acuity, the daily procedures and so forth. So we'll see that trend starting to happen. And that should be good for the patient because in theory, this should lead to lower cost. And lower cost should be translated to lower expected out-of-pocket costs for the patient. So hopefully that stays true because we're all trying to deliver the highest value of care at the lowest cost. So this is why we're starting to see this. One of the things that you touched base upon is how is it good for the patients? Is it good for the hospitals? But what about the rural hospitals? What is that model going to look like? Because they don't have the size. So if you're a small rural hospital or even community hospital, what is your play? Because you can't negotiate at the same rate as these mega health systems anymore. So you better find a way to affiliate or be part of a system somehow just to be able to compete and stay relevant. So I am not sure how that will play out. I foresee those smaller facilities getting absorbed or affiliated somehow, but then the problem comes down to what is the governing body, who actually makes the decisions. So still to be determined, but in theory, the reason for this type of mega mergers is really to try to drive the highest quality care at the lowest cost so that we could maximize the reimbursements.
Yeah, and I think you're right that the rural hospitals will be eventually absorbed into these larger organizations. But the governance is going to be a major issue, since rural hospitals and the decision making they do is very different than these large academic centers, or even hospitals in a urban environment. So I think that's going to be interesting to see the logistics play out there. But I think rural hospitals don't have any choice. I think the irony of all these mergers, though, is that many hospitals would probably argue that the government, Medicare in particular, and other payers are really pushing them towards these mega mergers because they want to start paying them on a population health basis or a value-based care basis. And in order to do that, you need to have the full population under your purview. As a small organization, you can't do that if you're going to be paid based on value-based care. So they make that argument, I think, that hey, you're pushing us towards doing this, but then the SEC probably comes in and says, hey, we don't want these mega mergers because you're essentially creating a monopoly on the healthcare system, so that there's no choice for the patient. And so there's this kind of competing interest between the SEC and the shift to value-based care that I don't know how you reconcile those two.
Yep, exactly. And it's a hard thing to figure out what is the right balance. I was talking to health systems probably 2-3 years ago. They're a $3 billion system. A few years ago, $2 to $3 billion entity is considered a pretty well-established entity. Now with all these mega mergers, what is the right size that you need to be at to stay relevant? 6 billion, 10 billion? I don't know. So there's a lot of $3 billion systems that's trying to affiliate somehow to get to that $10 billion mark. So it's a tough challenge, and I'm not sure whether anyone knows what the right play is. And then when you think about it from a job perspective, lots of redundancies too, right? You can't have 5 CEOs. So what happens there?
Well, and if you look at some of the large health systems, they kind of do. I've heard from friends that work at Intermountain that that pretty much owns healthcare in Utah, that every hospital works like its own organization, and certainly they have integrated for certain things, but I've heard many people complain about how each organization has its own autonomy, and so I think we're going to be dealing with that for a long time.
Definitely, that's every organizational struggle. Well, what is the right size? What is the right balance? So still to be determined, but I'll be curious to see whether it really works out to the benefit of the patient, which is, at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and Charisse Menard has chimed in. She said, I often wonder, particularly in the South, if patient impact is correctly measured. While long-term benefits may be realized eventually, in the short term, patients may suffer. And I think that's true, because the benefits that you talked about treating a population and the population health efforts usually take time. It's not something that you merge and then now those benefits come to the patient. So, I think, Charisse's comments are good as far as the short-term versus long-term impact.
Definitely agree. And, I was fortunate to work in that region as well, and there's public news now, but facilities in one state is actually filling with the facilities in a different state that's not geographically even close. So I'm talking about a 4 or 5 mile drive. So when that happens, the bigger brand was in Memphis, the facilities in Jackson, Mississippi Baptist. What happens now? They're so far away. But that affiliation is primarily due just to be able to drive size for negotiations. But quality of care probably stays the same. So hopefully they could figure out ways to reduce cost. But it's still a lot of turmoil in the region and even the area. So those smaller facilities is still to be determined what will really happen.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on insurance negotiations, but my gut tells me that if they're negotiating better rates from the insurance companies, so the hospital benefits, I guess you could say tangentially the patient benefits as well if the hospital gets better rates, but it's pretty rare that I see them pushing down those savings to the patients. I mostly see them increasing prices. So, I'm skeptical that the patient will really benefit that much as opposed to the health systems themselves. So let's switch to kind of a tech standpoint. What do these mega mergers mean from a tech standpoint? And, is this a good or a bad thing looking at the tech?
Well, the bigger players are going to dominate in terms of we'll just use the EMR. I think that's the very common theme. That's the major system that's going to be impacted or affecting the health system. So when you have two big systems merging together, they need to share information. It's going to be tough if you have Epic and Cerner. I'll be very frank. How is that going to work? But if you have either Epic or Cerner that's leading the charge, or Epic or Cerner facility that's leading the charge on the affiliation or merger, it's a lot easier discussion when they're trying to acquire a smaller facility. Most likely they'll make that switch. And what you will see is a pickup in revenue. I don't know how big, but there's a pickup in revenue for these larger EMR systems, while the smaller ones are going to lose market share. So we're seeing that all the time right now. We're seeing lots of health systems become vendors. I think we talked about this in one of our previous shows. Health system becoming a vendor where they're hosting the EMR for smaller players because they can't afford it. Well, now you're also going to see that happen, where by just this affiliation and mergers, they're going to extend their system out even further. So unfortunately, the bigger players are going to keep on acquiring market share, while the medium, mid-sized, and small players are going to lose, just based on this trend of mega mergers.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's going to be fun to watch it play out when a huge health system on Cerner acquires or merges with a huge health system on Epic, and they both have the clout where the one can't tell the other to get rid of their system, or they've invested so much that it's nearly impossible to consider switching to one streamlined system. So we'll see how that plays out. I agree. I think it's going to be a challenge, but I think there's other angles that are really interesting. One is that rural angle you talked about, because large health systems and large organizations in general just aren't that innovative, and they don't push down the innovations or the benefits that are needed by, say, a rural hospital that they might acquire or they might bring into their organization. And so I wonder if innovation is going to suffer as we get these massive health systems. So that's kind of the negative angle, is just the oversized organizations are slow to move and slow to adopt new technology. On the other end, you have a lot of these technologies like machine learning and analytics and some of the AI things that are happening. Many of those need the data at scale to be effective. And so you could argue that these new mega mergers will provide enough resources, enough data, enough technology and support and assets to be able to provide these new machine learning algorithms that will benefit everyone, that certainly a rural hospital couldn't do on their own. So I guess I'm sitting here between these two sides that are like, okay, do I like the large health system that can afford to invest in innovation and machine learning and have the data, or do I think that they won't push down the innovation and the large organizational structure will just kill innovation because of sheer size and inability to move?
Yeah, I think that's a very good sort of angle to think about it. I do foresee innovation being pushed down because the small players probably are not there yet. So any type of additional technology or any type of additional solutions will most likely be a benefit. But from the rural or the smaller facility standpoint, they lose out on having any sort of input as well, because it will be driven centrally. There's no way you can have so many decision makers. So I think from that standpoint, they will suffer from being able to impact those kind of decisions. But hopefully, from a benefit standpoint, they will get the latest and greatest that they probably would not have been able to either afford or obtain previously. But another challenge is some of these rural areas. One thing that's always missing is the fundamental infrastructure. Just getting connectivity to broadband there, that may be missing. So there's a lot of infrastructure that still needs to be deployed throughout various regions of the US just to be able to have the basic necessities of the internet. So hopefully these mega mergers will also accelerate that so that people can get connected and be able to have that basic infrastructure so that they can utilize technology a little bit more efficiently.
So let's move on to the next topic. The next topic is really around data governance. And I loved how you framed it, David, that you said, is it another health IT buzzword, this idea of data governance? And I think there's a couple of angles to look at this. One is around data governance, around making sure you have the right data, that you have clean data, and all those things? And are people actually doing it, or are they just talking about it? And then maybe the second side of things is something around data governance. I think a lot of people just think standards are going to solve their data governance issues. And so, by having FHIR implemented by all of the EHR vendors, we're solved and all will be well and life's good. So any thoughts around data governance there?
When I originally put the question together, I didn't think about it from your angle of standards. But yes, standards is one thing that will definitely help, and it has been, I won't say crutch, but it has been somewhat of a stumbling block to getting things moving forward. If you just think about just getting interoperability, it's been very difficult because we don't have the standards defined that everyone can use. And the same thing for data, from a data analytics standpoint, which is where data governance ties in for every organization. What is that definition that you want to use to define this one data element? But the reason why I put that question forth is I would love to hear feedback, is because I've seen a lot of organizations, every organization is struggling to be a data-driven organization, whether they want to say they acknowledge that or not. Everyone's trying to become that data-driven organization, and everyone's trying to figure out how to get there. Some may be more mature than others, but everyone's still trying to figure that piece out. And working at multiple organizations, I've seen one of the responses has been, well, let's set up data governance first before we could figure out analytics. Well, yes and no. Well, you focus so much on the data governance piece, you're going to be waiting for a long time just to get started. And the world of technology, it's all about speed and agility. How quickly can you get something moving versus trying to come up with that perfect solution? So my question and my thought process on data governance is, it could also become a stumbling block for an internal organization trying to create that perfect standard that we're trying to create nationally as well. So I think that was my thought process as far as data governance being somewhat sometimes a buzzword, but also it's a crutch in terms of how do you move forward, because everyone has a strategy, everyone knows how to use data, but if we're solely focused on creating the standard, we may never get there.
It's interesting because I think it almost points to the idea that people use that as a crutch, like you said, that instead of doing the hard work of actually figuring out what we want to accomplish with the data, let's just spend all our time cleaning the data to make sure it's accurate. Because they say, oh, we can't do anything with the data till it's clean, which is largely true. But if you decide what you want to do with the data and the data that would actually be actionable, then it's worth your time to go and clean the data. I've seen so many, especially, usually they end up being called enterprise data warehouse projects that spend millions of dollars and thousands of hours trying to clean the data, aggregate the data. And that's an important part of analytics, but they have no goals what they're going to do with the data once they actually aggregate it and have it cleaned up. And so then they wonder, okay, well, we spent millions, what did we get out of it? And so it's burned a lot of leaders on investing in data, because you build all of this, you clean all of this, and then they say, okay, what did we get? And you're like, well, we have this beautiful data warehouse of all our data. And you're like, well, how did that help patients? And they're like, well, I mean, now we can do stuff. It's like, okay, so you just spent all this time on data governance with no actual goals and efforts to really achieve something.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that happen as well. So hopefully it gets to the point to where people, the end goal is you want to make a decision, or make a lot of decisions based on data versus experience and intuition. I think you still use that as far as trusting your gut, but you want to be able to have data to back it up. Prime example is, physicians, they don't know whether to pick implant A, or surgeons, they don't know whether to pick implant A or B, because maybe they don't have the data that's put forth in front of them in terms of cost. I bet you told them implant A costs 3 times more versus B, and you get the same outcome. They're going to make the right decision and choose B. So we always want to get that to that point where people are aware and have that transparency with data. But I've seen lots of organizations just struggle with, as far as how, what's the end goal, number one. Number two is, how do you even get there relatively quickly versus try and create this perfect scenario. So, I mean, I'm struggling with that as we speak right now, to where people want to focus on data governance rather than, here's a solution, here's a playbook that's been vetted by our vendor hundreds, thousands of times. Let's use that playbook and let's just move forward. But I'm sure other folks had that same struggle. And then on the bigger scale, with the standards discussions, I mean, I don't know where that's going to lie, right? The recent article or research standard that's been thrown out there is the Smart on Fire. Great standard, but no one's really using it, or it's not as pervasive as we would hope it would be. So that's another example of having some sort of standard but not being widely adopted.
Yeah, and I've been talking with Galen Healthcare Solutions. They had this interesting project called ClearIT where they brought together all these users to share best practices of how to implement, and in their case, I think it was Meditech rules engine, and creating these Meditech rules that would help facilitate the proper use of the data that's in the EHR so that they could actually produce these outcomes. And, I mean, I was reminded of it when you commented that, you're working through those challenges, and why are we trying to create our own when 100 other hospitals already figured this out and have a best practices? And so I think there's a challenge there of how do we get hospital organizations, healthcare organizations to share those best practices. My experience is they usually want to, but there's not an easy forum for them to do it. I'm actually working on a conference called healthIT Expo at expo.health that, we want to facilitate those type of interactions, because health systems and hospitals want to share that. They want to share their best practices, but where do you do it? There's no like incentive for you in Kansas City to share with the Children's Hospital in Dallas your best practice. You're fine to do it. You're okay to do it. There's no competitive reason not to do it, but there's no incentive for you to do it. But if we create a venue, a conference, an event, a platform that allows you to share those easily with them, and then you receive in return their best practices, then I think that's what needs to happen more and more.
Yeah, definitely. So hopefully we'll make progress on this versus talking about it for the next 5 years.
Definitely. It could certainly be a crutch if all you do is talk about how do we make sure the data is clean and don't actually use the data to move the needle for patients.
Exactly.
So, all right, let's hit the third topic. It's around healthcare apps, and this was prompted by an article by Ann Zeiger, and she wrote it from kind of an e-patient perspective. She has a couple of chronic issues that she deals with, and so she's a frequent flyer at the hospitals and health systems that she visits, and so she wrote and she wrote from an interesting perspective that a little surprised me, because when she said healthcare apps, how many is enough? I thought she was talking about kind of these mobile health apps, these personal health apps that you could download. I forget the latest numbers. I've seen 40,000. I've seen 70,000 health apps on the iPhone App Store and Android Store. It's like there's so many. But she wrote from a different perspective that I think is actually more appropriate for CXO Scene, which is how many apps should a hospital and health system provide their users? Do they do one for billing? Do they do one for doing their chronic cardiac condition? Do they do one for access to their medical record? Another one to be able to communicate with their doctor? Another one to communicate with their dietitian? Another one, blah, blah. So she's like, no, that's too many. We need one app for one health system and have, everything involved. What's your thoughts on that? And I express from a tech standpoint, if you're getting 10 solutions from 10 different vendors, then sometimes as a hospital CIO, you have a challenging choice to make, either to implement it or not provide that service to the patient. So what are your thoughts on this app proliferation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, and it's a very correct observation, right? So the latest number I've heard about mobile apps is 100,000. So I'm sure it's somewhere in that range, but think about it. I think I shared with the previous CXO talk is how many application portfolio I have just under my organization. About 600. Then you think about how many for clinical aspect, easily over 10, easily. I mean, it's probably in the 30 to 50 range. So then you think about from a patient's perspective, if you're not integrated, as the trend is that we're all trying to get towards the integrated platform because it does make interoperability a lot easier, but also this angle of how many apps is enough for the patient, right? Your dietary app is going to be different. If you're an inpatient in a room, if you don't have some sort of centralized system to be that aggregator for entertainment, dietary, patient education, physician go into your portal, and messaging a clinician. That's already 5 different solutions out there that I just named right there, just off the top of my head. So yes, it's very easy to see that applications sprawl and get to that point to where even as a customer, a patient, you have no idea what to do, because you may even also have 10 different logins if they're all different. If you're smart enough to create the same logins, you're probably well off. But if you're not, you probably have 10 different logins. And what's worse is if there's, I'm sure it happens, I'm sure it's still a challenge if all these different apps are not talking to each other appropriately or getting bits and pieces of information. So definitely, it's a struggle, and it's good to hear from a patient perspective, because at least these are users that are using these systems effectively, and now they're showing their frustration and sharing their experience. You don't hear that a lot because not everyone's using all the various tools out there. The ones that they probably use most often is the patient portal. Hopefully you're integrated enough to where the patient portal has at least 60% of what you need. But yes, there's probably a big 30–40% gap, and that gap could be a big number of different applications as well. So I do see that angle, and I do feel that pain, because even within my department, within our organization, we're supporting that this vast majority of apps. And what we're trying to do is create another app to be the aggregator of these apps. That way they have this one-stop shop and one app to go to be that sort of starter to get connected with something else. And that's what I'm only trying to do, that internally, just to create a information systems department app. And that's for my end users within our organization to be able to not have 10 different apps on their phone to go to. So when you take that and think about from a patient's perspective, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the fact that a lot of people go to multiple health systems. So, they might go to your hospital once, but then they might go to another hospital later, and they might have 5 with you, 5 with this one, 5 with that one. But even within the same health system, it's hard to imagine that they could create an app for all apps. I think the portal, the EHR patient portal, is the thing that's gotten closest. And even that there's, we've seen some integrations with EHR vendors trying to create APIs that allow other third-party vendors to integrate with the portal. So we've seen a little bit of that. But then, that doesn't even really touch the mobile app world, right? I mean, I can't say I've seen a patient portal that's really been executed well on mobile, which is kind of a sad thought if you think about it. And so, if they're not doing mobile, it's just a website, which, I mean, they can kind of load on mobile. The web browsers and the screens are getting large enough, but not a pure app experience. I haven't seen for any patient portals, let alone allowing a constellation of other apps to integrate effectively with it. So I think we're going to have this problem for a long time.
Yeah, and especially with mobile being the platform of choice, right? That's your go-to platform now. It's not your desktop. It's not your PC, not even your laptop. It's really your mobile phone that is a platform of choice. So yeah, I think that's a correct observation. And you see lots of great startup companies who are able to create that great experience in terms of a mobile-first platform, but they just can't get integrated. I think one thing I shared recently is a lot of these enterprise systems are built on legacy technology, so they're not even mobile-friendly themselves. So being able to take that code, the legacy code, and transform it into mobile ready and mobile-first, it's not an easy chore. So that is a struggle, and we will continue to see that struggle, unfortunately, because these are the major dominant systems in all the health systems. So I'm not sure what the answer is unless it's a rewrite or a major system.
Yeah, and maybe the answer is a third-party vendor that's really, I called it a patient management system. That the patient is managed through it, and really it provides a whole suite of services to the patient, whether it's access to their records, whether it's communication, whether it's billing, whether it's access to new apps, whether it's access to information. I like there's one company I'm advising. called Care Cognetics, which is working on rewards for health system, for patients and health systems and payers and providers. And it's interesting to think about that from a rewards perspective. If you have all of those things in an app that is really patient-centric, that would change the relationship between the patient and what they were actually doing. Now, it's going to take a while to get there. I think, for all of those integrated and making sure the rewards are aligned appropriately. But maybe that's one way we could get to a patient-centered app. Because right now, when you look at most of the apps that hospitals and health systems are using, they're very provider-focused. They're not very patient-focused. So it might take someone coming in from the outside and saying, what should I do for the patient, to really open those doors.
Yeah, no, I think there are some good vendors or startups trying to focus on that space, but getting traction is the hardest thing in this market, as you're aware as well.
Yep, for sure. Well, great. I think this was a great discussion for CXO Scene. Number 4, I can't believe we made it to 4 episodes. That's pretty good.
We'll get to 100 soon, and we'll just keep it going.
That's great. Well, thanks for everyone that watched live, and also those that are going to watch the recorded version. Thanks. I'm John Lynn, the founder of healthcarescene.com, and my partner in crime, David Chou. He's the Vice President and Chief Information and Digital Officer at Children's Mercy, Kansas City. Check him out on Twitter at dchow1107. Thanks, David.
Thanks, everyone. See you guys in 2 weeks.